Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Virtua Talks Metaverse. This week, we're talking to Isabel Davies from Wigan about legal implications in the metaverse. So, hi, Isabel.
Hi, Ari. Nice to have me on. Thanks very much.
No problem. So, firstly, can you give us a little bit of background? Where are you from? What is your area of expertise?
Sure. So I'm an interactive entertainment lawyer. I've always been a massive gamer. So gaming is a big part of my practice. I got a Game Boy Color when I was about 6 or 7 years old and did law at university, wanted to be a lawyer and just thought I'm going to try and combine these kind of two parts of my life. Right now I work in a private practice law firm. So I work for a firm called Wigan, who are one of the biggest kind of media and entertainment law firms in the UK. We're known for our kind of tech work, media work, entertainment work. I sit in the video games team within the business. And before I was at Wigan, I was in-house for a little while. So I worked for Disney Interactive for a year, worked for King for nearly 2 years. King most well known for their game Candy Crush Saga, which when I was working at King around the kind of 2011, 2012, 2013 period was kind of at its boom point in terms of mobile free to play. So I think one of the interesting things about the metaverse is that it's now kind of having that boom moment that mobile free to play had, 6, 7, 8, 9 years ago. And I know we'll talk about it a bit, but my background is video games and esports, and it's just interesting to see which parts of that are kind of transitioning to look at the metaverse more broadly. So it's a very exciting place to be.
Yeah, definitely. And as you say, there's so much for us to talk about in the space. And your current role at Wigan, what sort of people, businesses do you work with on a daily?
Yeah, so exclusively with kind of, video games or interactive businesses. That's what I've done my whole career. Normally it's a mix of kind of commercial and regulatory work. So commercial contracts, the prime example being kind of, publishing agreements for video games, licensing agreements for games, more broadly, maybe things like sorting out tournament rules and licensing for esports. And then on the regulatory side, which is actually probably where I skew a bit more my time-wise now, is thinking about all the kind of legal issues that can impact a product. So child protection, consumer law, gambling, data protection, and then to a lesser extent and slightly separately kind of intellectual property issues. But we've got a dedicated IB team at Wigan that very nobly helped me with those issues. And then in terms of people and businesses, it's anything from, teeny tiny indie developers that are just starting out, maybe making their first game or first product, all the way up to some of the biggest platforms in the world. So very different issues. At one end, you've got an indie developer that has possibly never engaged a lawyer before or doesn't have their own in-house legal team, versus a very, very big platform who have, monstrous legal teams, and you're essentially inputting on perhaps a very unique or nascent issue where they just need an extra mind or somebody that's got a bit more of a holistic view of the market to input. So great. It's great in terms of variety, in terms of the work and the people.
It sounds really interesting. So background gaming and interactive entertainment, how's that, and you kind of touched on this a moment ago, but how is that transitioning into the metaverse? And being a gamer, you're obviously very familiar with the space.
Yeah, so I think it's been really interesting. On one hand, you've got video games that are very much built around, a single player kind of linear narrative experience. And obviously those kind of games companies are probably not necessarily looking into the metaverse in any real detail. But on the flip side, you've got, platforms or like particularly the bigger multiplayer online games that it almost is a natural transition to start thinking about this kind of broader metaverse, about, how they open up their spaces to, different parts of the online community or different experiences for their existing community. And I think lockdown really increased that, lockdown and the pandemic really increased that sense of understanding by the wider world that games are a great space, not just for playing, but also for socializing and building communities. And I think games companies are really thinking about how they can build on this. So yeah, my kind of experiences in the metaverse and advising the metaverse is very much from the kind of, games companies to get into this space, and less of maybe like the social media platforms getting into this space, etc. But I think there's a lot of different things that these different companies can learn from each other.
Absolutely. And going into the metaverse, what are some of the unique legal issues that you've encountered, we might encounter as we push into the space?
I think the way I normally describe it is most of the legal issues aren't actually unique, but they are just much more heightened or much more intense just because of the metaverse that's being touted. I know there's different ways that you could define it. There's different ways that it may develop. But if it is this kind of very deeply immersive, deeply exciting environment, then ultimately we have this in a much lesser extent as gaming and social media and other kind of technical experiences now. And they are similar issues. It's just reapplying them to this much more immersive environment. So I think really the big ones that we see at the moment are, consumer protection issues, like, and we'll talk about this I'm sure later, but consumers don't necessarily know what it is they're buying or getting involved with, or they're perhaps being, what's the word I'm looking for? There are harms that they are being subjected to that perhaps they weren't prepared for, or at least they are much more heightened just because of the immersive nature of the metaverse. Intellectual property rights, brands getting involved in the space, again, not necessarily knowing what they're getting involved, not necessarily understanding how their brand may be used in a particular metaverse. So that's been really interesting. And I think the one that possibly is a bit more, I'd say, new and nascent is the kind of financial regulation piece, which is, there aren't necessarily all these issues in every metaverse, but I think for those metaverses that are very much based on decentralized tech or utilizing things like NFTs, that is seeing a kind of new wave of financial questions about, okay, how does it fit in with wider laws about securities and stuff like that, which is obviously a very specialized area, and we have to get financial regulation lawyers involved in those spaces just because there's so much to unpack there. So as I said, there are some new areas, but actually I think the thing about the metaverse is that most of the time these aren't new issues. It's just they are so much more keenly felt, I think, just because of how the metaverse is being built, and essentially we want to make it this highly immersive experience.
Absolutely. And you kind of touched on it there, but for brands who maybe operate internationally or nationally, how do they come into the metaverse, and how is it treated as a unique space?
Yeah, so I think this is one of the areas we've advised quite heavily on, which is brands getting into different metaverses, and each metaverse has its own pros and cons essentially, and there's a bunch of different questions that we ask brands before they even think about getting into the metaverse. And normally our first question actually isn't a legal one, it's a why do you want to go into the metaverse, or why do you want to be in this particular metaverse? I think kind of questioning the brand on their commercial goals is almost important as in dealing with the legal issues, because we've had a lot of brands bandwagoning onto various things, events, metaverses over the last particularly 6 to 8 months. And it kind of just leaves the consumer going, well, you're not adding to the space. You're not adding anything new or novel. You're just doing it because everyone else is doing it. So I think getting brands to just stop and have a think about, why are they doing this? Why do they think it's important for the brand? Why do they think their particular audience is on this particular metaverse, I think is actually really important. And then kind of once we get almost past that first hurdle of, is this a good idea? What are you adding to the space? How are you driving the metaverse forward? There's a bunch of different things that they have to consider. I think advertising rules is an obvious one. This is something that's been felt keenly over the internet over the last 5 to 10 years, but making sure that commercial content is clear from gameplay or other non-commercial content. This has been something that, influencers on TikTok and Instagram have been dealing with for years already, about in terms of making it clear when something is an ad and when they're not an ad. I think understanding the target audience of that particular metaverse is really important. If you're an alcohol brand, you probably shouldn't be advertising on a metaverse that's mainly played by children, because that could get you in a load of hot water. So it's understanding, again, your brand, where you're going, why. I think brands considering how their intellectual property is being used. So, if you're in a branded metaverse, but the way the metaverse works means that somebody from another metaverse could wander in with an digital avatar with your competitor's brand on a t-shirt, wandering in your metaverse, then are you okay with that? Are you okay with potentially other brands mingling with your brand? How is user-generated content used in that metaverse? If you are a brand and you go into the metaverse and somebody's, graffitiing UGC, really terrible things all over your brand, is that something you're happy with? I.e., the fact your kind of message could be subverted. And then trademarks, really boring, but does your trademarks cover metaverse activities if this is something you're serious about? And then I think the final kind of big one is actually considering what the metaverse itself allows. Can that particular metaverse just kind of, revoke your experience at will? Or, can they, do they even allow kind of commercial brand presence at all? Or do you have to go through specific avenues? Do you own what you create? Do you own that experience or that brand presence that you've made? Or is that all owned by the respective metaverse? So that's just some of the questions that we have to answer when brands go into the metaverse. So there's a lot to unpack, and I mean, it's super, super interesting, but yeah. It's a bit of a minefield.
Absolutely. I mean, it's just opening a real can of worms, isn't it? With as soon as you start asking a few questions, you realise that it's quite a complex situation that we can face, and that kind of touches on a brand perspective. How will that affect the individual coming to the space?
So I think, as I mentioned, kind of advertising rules about individuals being able to understand when something is, promoted commercial content versus, organic content that's maybe being made by another user. I think that's important. And I think particularly for online spaces that have a younger audience, that in particular is important because children have a far lesser understanding about when something might be commercial versus not. And I think, as I highlighted earlier, the kind of financial regulation piece is very, very complex. So I think to the extent that metaverses are using, crypto assets and marketing crypto assets, they just have to be very, very careful about making sure that the consumer understands what they're investing in. The Advertising Standards Authority in the UK has been really hot on this issue. They've released a lot of guidance and they've slapped a lot of risks about poor advertising of crypto assets, just because it's not clear that past success doesn't essentially mean you're going to have success in the future. They are in some ways, kind of pseudo investments. So I think consumers need to go in with their eyes open and, be aware of what they're purchasing. And ultimately, if the company isn't making it clear what you're, investing in or entering, then probably best to try somewhere else, or at least ask a question of that company. Can you explain to me a bit more what it is you're actually offering me here?
Absolutely. And we touched on it briefly there, but children, people who are vulnerable and need to be kept safe in the metaverse. Reports have been of misconduct have been documented. How can we ensure that those people are kept safe and not taken advantage of?
I think child safety is a really interesting piece because it's something that for a number of years wasn't really being actively dealt with by a lot of regulators. That laws like the GDPR, which is data protection legislation predominantly just for everyone as a whole. As I said, it just focuses on everyone. But in the last couple of years, there's been much more kind of child-specific guidance and legislation coming out. I think a really good example of that is the Children's Code in the UK, which is a binding code of practice under the GDPR, which essentially just looks at child-related issues to do with data and safety online. And there's a bunch of different points that are coming out of that. I think there's going to be heightened expectation for online services to have things like parental controls, not to use nudge techniques in a way that's negative, to have kind of robust community standards that are well enforced. And this code of practice is being rolled out in various forms in a bunch of different jurisdictions. And the UK Data Protection Authority has been particularly interested in how social media, gaming and streaming have specifically looked into this code, and the firm Wigan's been heavily involved in advising games companies looking at this code and implementing it. So I think actually the kind of increase of the metaverse and the rise of the metaverse alongside this kind of dual track of child safety becoming more of a regulatory priority, is somewhat timely, I think. And ultimately companies should be kind of, I think, thinking about kind of what tools they have in place in terms of reporting, chat filters. If there's chat in the metaverse, should that be on by default if you know that there's loads of kids there, or should there be something a bit more nuanced? There's no hard and fast rules here. Ultimately, the company has to kind of assess their audience and assess what the risks are and deal with them accordingly. But from what we've seen, I think giving the consumer, child, parent, just as many tools as possible in terms of being able to customize and tailor that experience, I think is really important. and the children piece is one thing, and then there's also the much broader online safety piece, which is coming. The EU's got draft legislation around online safety, so's the UK, so's the US, and again, that's very much looking at, you know, harmful or illegal content online, and how basically it's going to become a much bigger company responsibility to deal with that content proactively and reactively. So I think that also is something that companies thinking about the metaverse will have to have at the forefront of the mind, in terms of, you know, building something from the ground up that keeps, you know, safety by design in mind, because it is tricky when you've got an existing product and new safety rules come out that you then have to kind of back engineer your product. Whereas at least with, I think, new products in the metaverse, there is an opportunity to kind of try and do things as right as possible. I say the regulator's vision of right, from day one.
Absolutely. I think, you know, there has been some debate over responsibility for, you know, from organisations to their users. So that will be taken into account in the space. Another topic, play to earn must be an area that you've encountered. What are some of the legal implications of gaming to earn in the digital space at this time?
Yeah, so I felt like play to earn got a lot of press, you know, the back end of last year and early this year, and it's somewhat kind of fallen off the, you know, at least the kind of immediate press radar. You know, as I described earlier, it's really a kind of dual wielding of financial regulations and consumer protection. And, you know, those rules and regulations are kind of playing catch up here. This is something that I don't think many laws would have necessarily, or many legislators would have had in mind when writing these laws several years ago. And I think transparency is ultimately the key from a consumer perspective. It's making sure that players know what they're buying into, how the system works, if there's various different currencies or crypto assets, like how they work and how they fit in within the wider play to earn ecosystem. You know, what wallets need to be used? Are they run by a third party? What underlying blockchain is used? Is that run by a third party? Essentially, just being as clear as possible about how things all piece together. And I think there's also just much broader questions as well. I think, you know, do consumers necessarily know that they might have to pay tax on their capital gains from the money that you make in games? I think, you know, there's not been any kind of real big, you know, presses or case stories on that yet. But, you know, someone out there somewhere is probably doing incredibly well from play to earn games and maybe isn't paying the tax on that money they're making. And, you know, obviously tax rules vary hugely jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but there will come at some point where someone will probably get a ring up from their tax authority going, you seem to have got a lot of money in your account recently. Where exactly did this come from? And I think one of the more meta things that's been, posited recently is, you know, at what point does a consumer become a business in and of themselves if they're making that much money? I think that's a very contentious question, because I think ultimately many people feel that because of that kind of power dynamic between a company and a potentially an individual, that they should still have that consumer relationship, which obviously comes with a lot of protections under the law. But some people have said, you know, ultimately, if you're making that much money and you're able to engage with the company on a bit more of a direct level, then is it a business to business relationship? I said that's a bit more of an avant-garde comment, I think, but it's an interesting one to discuss, I think, nonetheless.
Absolutely, it's certainly a topic to explore. And as you mentioned, with the way, you know, no one predicted that play to earn would become such a topic of interest in such a short period of time. And I guess with a lot of the topics that we're actually focusing on today, these are new issues in new spaces that do need to be explored, you know, and conceptualized and put into, you know, better understood.
Absolutely.
So next question, being anonymous through avatars is a lot of what people want in the metaverse. People want to live through avatars and be in the metaverse. But on some level, do they need to be identifiable and therefore held accountable for their actions in the space?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting one, because I think a lot of it will partly depend on what functionality is available in any particular metaverse. as I mentioned earlier, I think there's legislation coming through on online safety that's going to make this more difficult. So, for example, as drafted, the online safety bill in the UK currently, for the very biggest providers of online content, which is predominantly going to be the big social media giants, a lot of whom are kind of pushing the metaverse and doing their development in this space. Currently under that bill, those social media companies have to give users the options to verify their identity, and then in turn only allow interaction with other verified users. So you could end up almost having a metaverse that's split down the middle in terms of there are verified users that want to contact only other verified users, and then there's another side of it where it's anonymous users only contact with anonymous users. Maybe that's something that has to be explored, but I think a lot of people feel that ultimately the metaverse should be as an open space as possible and as interoperable as possible. So does that somewhat defeat the object by having to essentially divide it down the middle? And I think as well, there's obviously, we go on to this, I think, but there's the much broader point of, how these spaces governed, what kind of things need to be taken into consideration. I think ultimately, to the extent that self-regulation can happen and these communities can govern themselves, ultimately there are still laws. There have been laws about how people govern themselves on the internet for a long time. The Computer Misuse Act in the UK dates back to 1990. So I think having a completely lawless space, I think, is going to be somewhat difficult. It's just, okay, how do we work around those, and to what extent can we give people the freedom they want without necessarily causing either issues for other users or the companies and then the public more generally?
Absolutely. And we mentioned this earlier ahead of the call, but Meta, Microsoft teaming up to create the Metaverse standards along with a host of other tech companies. What will be the impact of that, and will it be good for the space?
Yeah, it was really a really interesting development, actually, because I think a lot of people in the metaverse space were saying, ultimately, I think most people think that the metaverse has some level of interoperability, and ultimately, if these companies are just making siloed metaverses, then perhaps this isn't the kind of online utopia that everyone has been dreaming of. And I think the fact that they've got so many notable companies to sign up straight off the bat is great. I think there's a couple of larger companies that are missing from the roster, perhaps not unsurprisingly. But I think it's obviously very early days. This was only announced recently, and the broad message seems to be around kind of creating interoperable tech standards. But actually, I think one of the interesting things looking through that list of companies is that there are a bunch of different NGOs in there. I think, for example, Spatial Web Foundation is on there, and they look at not just maintaining technical standards, but also ethical standards. So I think that's really interesting in terms of, okay, they're not maybe looking at this from a pure business perspective, but there does need to be some sort of corporate responsibility here as well. I guess those that may be more skeptical of this development are those that are hoping for a kind of decentralized future, because it's unknown how this is going to develop, and it's unknown what these companies are considering. But this feels possibly like a step against that direction of wanting something that's not centralized around these big corporates. So we'll be very interested to see how that develops.
And the flip side of that is somebody breaks the rules. How is the space going to be policed, and how are the rules going to be enforced?
Yeah. So I touched upon this earlier, and I think ultimately, I sort of think sometimes it's interesting because you sort of read on the internet people talking about the internet like it's a lawless place now, but that is clearly not the case. There are rules around, what ISPs have to do if there's copyright infringement on, specific domains, etc. There's rules around, spyware, malware, stuff like that. There's obviously rules around, speech and harm, and that will continue to grow as we've discussed. And I think it's going to be interesting to see, particularly with stuff like the mobile standard, the Metaverse Standards Forum, not only are they thinking about interoperability standards, but is there going to be a sort of governance standard as well? Because it's one thing to be able to move from metaverse to metaverse potentially, but if you're going from one space to another where the rules are slightly different, or you're being governed by different laws, different countries' laws, that has the potential to be really confusing, I think, for consumers. And I think that's something that will definitely have to be thought about. I think the thing that I think about is ultimately there's got to be a mix of, basically, I think, because essentially it seems that obviously the corporates are probably going to be the ones to push the metaverse most, because they've got the money, they've got the talent, they've got the data. And I think that's true to a certain extent, but I'm going to be very interested to see how the regulators react to that. Are the regulators going to be, curious, open-minded, going into it, with a sense of, do we encourage innovation here, or is it going to be maybe impulsive or quick reactions that may stifle innovation? So I think there's definitely conversations that I'm hoping and I'm sure are happening there, because I think there's a balance to be struck in terms of, do we just let the corporates just essentially go off and make their own developments, or do we get regulators involved? I think the other interesting thing as well is that, what happens almost to kind of communities within the metaverse as well. So a good example would be, there's laws on the internet, there's certain things that kind of govern how we behave. But if you go onto, an online forum for a particular game or TV show, that forum will have specific rules for that forum, and you can get kicked out of that forum for breaking those rules. And that's a great example of where there's a self-governance, self-regulatory framework within a much wider sea of perhaps something a bit more rigid. So I can kind of see maybe the metaverse developing a bit like that as well, where those kind of small communities within metaverse have a bit more of a community model, self-governance, but there's something much bigger that kind of keeps the whole thing together perhaps. But again, this is just me spitballing some thoughts.
Each one of these questions could probably be about a half-hour conversation on their own. So appreciate
a lot to think about.
Yeah, and being such a new space, it's all being explored at this moment. And you touched on there, it's kind of a world without territory where you can be in multiple places at once, or operating on in a metaverse which is run out of a certain country, but you're based in another one. What are the implications? Which laws would you have to follow at that time? So, I appreciate a lot of this is still up in the air and to be discussed. And without going into specifics, any examples, any projects, any that you're working on at the moment which have maybe given you some interesting pointers?
So obviously can't speak about anything specifically, unfortunately, because it is so new. A lot of these topics are very much still active and ongoing. We've had a few, disputes metaverse related, but nothing that's reached the court or anything yet. I think one of the main issues that we are seeing is something that we spoke about much earlier in the conversation, is brands and understanding the metaverse they're getting into. There's been conversations to work through there in terms of brands understanding what it is they're getting from the metaverse and vice versa. So I'd say that is the area that's causing probably attention at the moment in terms of kind of legal, I wouldn't say disputes, but conversations, let's say.
And we touched on this earlier, actually, ahead of the call, which was preemptively seeking legal advice rather than after the fact. Is that what you're counselling a lot at the moment?
I mean, that's the golden rule for pretty much every lawyer. I think it's better to be proactive than reactive when it comes to legal issues. And as I was talking about with children's safety issues and online safety issues earlier, for creators and businesses that are making and building their products now, it's better to have safety by design, privacy by design principles from the ground up, rather than having to kind of reverse engineer it later. It's the same thing with legal advice. It's quite often easier to put something in place before the fact, but that's a tale as old as time. That predates the metaverse by a long time.
Right, and the last one. So what are you looking forward to in the space in the future, and will Wigan be the first practice to operate from the metaverse?
So when I was first thinking about this, my kind of main topic of interest was to see whether these big corporates do end up actually working together to make something interoperable, which obviously with the Metaverse Standards Forum pretty much just being announced, that really did pique my interest. I was like, oh, okay, there is an actual sense of, coming together here, which, I think for a lot of these companies, they are very, very closed off normally to each other, to these, further competitors. So I thought that was encouraging and interesting. And I think they're having their first meeting later this year. So I guess I'm hoping that they're going to be relatively open about the discussions that they're having. I say relatively open. They're not going to be telling us exactly what, here's our code base, I can imagine. But at least the concepts and the things that they are finding important. And as I highlighted earlier, I've not gone through the full list of who's actually part of the forum yet, but I saw a couple of kind of NGO names in there, a couple of companies thinking about ethical standards, not just, technical standards. I think it will be good to see these companies, engaging with third parties, whether it's regulators, civil rights groups, focus groups, etc. Just essentially getting as broad a net as possible in terms of trying to flush out potential issues. So I think more of that should be encouraged. And in terms of Wigan operating in the space, I honestly think it probably partly depends on the legal rules of the profession. My immediate question would be, does kind of solicitor client privilege exist in the metaverse? Like, could I give you legal advice in the metaverse and it be protected? I don't know, probably one for the Law Society to weigh in on there. But it's definitely one I'll be keeping in mind.
Yeah, and another can of worms that we can open another time. But we do have a land sale coming, so we'll save a spot for you to set up an office if
oh, excellent. I'll get our marketeers on it straight away.
Brilliant. Well, so that was everything from me. Really appreciate you coming on the call, and hope we can catch up again in the future and collaborate on a few other projects. But yeah, thanks so much for joining us.
No, thanks so much for having me, Harry. It was really interesting to talk about these issues, and yeah, as you said, maybe we'll have to touch base on this in a year or so's time to see what the lay of the land is.
Absolutely. So yeah, that's been Virtua Talks Metaverse. Thanks for everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.